Hi everyone. So after the positive response from the last video, I've been sort of digging through some of the conference papers I've given in the past and wanted to talk about some of the things I've presented, and so you can sort of see what this might look like in practice. And what I really wanted to talk about was this paper. I like this one. So this was a paper I delivered at the Youth and Horror Conference, run by the amazing Kat Lester and Kate Egan. And this was a conference that was sort of interested in the sort of the perhaps uneasy fusion of young people and horror. Um, and a lot of the people at that conference were sort of reflecting on the sort of horror and horrific things that they saw when they were kids. And I did that myself. I talked about sort of the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episodes, seeing horror movies, seeing things like The Mummy and those scarabs that went under your skin. At much too early an age, really, to sort of appreciate that horror. But the show that I wanted to talk about at that conference was this one, Courage the Cowardly Dog. It's a show I've loved for a long time, and I want to talk about really the way in which it fused traditions of animation and horror, and did it in a way that certainly is not unique, but sort of is perhaps really, really interesting and sort of perhaps more effective than any other example that I can think of. So I set the scene. So around the millennium, up-and-coming animators and writers, they were given free rein to create imaginative kids shows, and often these skewed towards coded adult humour. So you're talking about things like Johnny Bravo, you're talking about Cow and Chicken, and then on Nickelodeon there was Invader Zim. Now the show that I'm talking about was one of these. So this was John R. Dilworth's Courage the Cowardly Dog. And the premise of the show, in case you haven't seen it, there's this pink dog here, Courage, and he's perpetually terrified. He lives in the middle of nowhere, and that's the name of the town, with his owners, Muriel and Eustace, and nowhere is haunted by all sorts of horrors and monsters and terrors. And Courage is quite interesting in that it was an animated show presenting a world when sort of monsters appeared, in which bad things did happen, villains could win. This is not sort of kid-friendly in many cases. There were examples where sort of monsters won the day. Although everything would be back to the start of normal, back to normal at the start of the next episode, it was very rare that these episodes ended with a neat sort of happily ever after. In some cases they did, but it was really, really rare that this was the case. And this was a kid show that featured as basics for episodes psychological torture, domestic abuse, serial killers, sort of the impact of depression. It speaks to a really sort of different landscape that Courage occupied in this early 2000s animation landscape. So what I did in this paper is I talked about Courage in an aesthetic manner. Excuse me. I talked about its non-conventional animation practices. So both the show drawing on aesthetics and intertexts that were influenced by art and cinema, but also its incorporation of what I've termed unexpected art styles as a means of generating an uncanny effect. So let me begin by talking about art. So the influence of art and media in shaping the visual world of Courage the Cowardly Dog. It's been widely suggested that Muriel and Eustace owe to the farmer couple in Grant Wood's American Gothic, which you see there on the slide from 1930. It's also the case the depiction of the farmhouse itself, in terms of both the isolation and sort of the colour palette it normally occupies, and speaks to a 1948 painting by Andrew Wyliff titled Christina's World. So these are examples, of course, there's proof in the episodes that the creators were inspired by and sought to evoke art. This is an episode from the third season of the show titled So in Love Are We Two, in which the family go to the titular museum. They face animated versions of Mona Lisa on top left and the Thinker top right. Now, in this, the artworks come alive and they go on a number of dates in paintings, Hopper's Nighthawks, Rodin's The Kiss, and American Gothic itself. And before, in a particularly meta example, they discover an image of their in the gallery of their house concealed within Wood's painting, replacing the farmhouse that's originally there. And then the episode ends with the family going home through the artwork. It's sort of this sort of meta level of art influencing the show, and then that art being included within the show. Outside of specific works, the show generally owes to a lot of art, movements and styles, and surrealism is perhaps the most evident, but also to animation styles and principles that were codified largely by other animated works. And there's an episode, Tulip's Worm, which features a giant blue girl, and her animation resembles characters in the sort of iconic French animated film La Planète Sauvage. There's often a use of musical interludes, overly expressive animal protagonists. It speaks to things like Carl Starling's work on Warner Brothers shows like Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry. There's also quite an identifiable influence of German Expressionism. So this is a movement that is historically linked with the emergence of the horror genre. It's present both in the dark thematic undertones and their representation in the straight-line, distorted architecture of the world of courage, of the jaggedness of the characters, the ways in which the more surreal villains, like cats, for example, they're characterised by sharp points and quite unnatural angles. So horror is generated to an extent by the way in the characters and the world looks. And this can be seen in sort of quite an expressionistic sense. And the little green guy in the sort of the bottom left there is a guy called Dr. Zylost from an episode of The Tower of Dr. Zylost. And his moving tower on the right that sort of actively generates negative affect. Hold on to the way this tower looks. I'm going to return to it. And what I want to talk about now is sort of intertext references. It engaged with tons of them, and many of which would not really be considered particularly age appropriate for the sort of the general sort of younger viewer base. Some are innocuous. There's a snowman character voiced by voiced like Sean Connery, let me say. Evocations of 1950s sci-fi films dating back to the very first episode, The Chicken from Outer Space. The character on the right, a filmmaking zombie serial killer. His name is Benton Tarantella, clearly a thinly veiled reference to Quentin Tarantino, whose films you would not expect that a young viewership would have seen. In another example, Freaky Fred, which is an episode that's infamous even for Courage the Cowardly Dog. Our hero is pitted against a particularly lyrical barber. This is the premise that practically screams Sweeney Todd, right? And yet somehow sort of, I think, more sinister than the character. In a common vein for the show, he's not perhaps as evil as his first appearance suggests. I'm going to show you a clip here, which is how the character is introduced.
Hello, new friend. My name is Fred. The words you hear are in my head. I said my name is Fred, and I've been very naughty.
There's a distinct reminder here. This is a show that is meant for children. You hear the sort of the little nursery rhyme, sort of lullaby music box sounds in the background. In later scenes, as Fred shaves Courage, driven by a sort of a sexual compulsion for haircutting, the soundtrack comes to feature little girls singing in chorus, and this is really quite an infamous thing. So these sort of wider references, but there are, of course, geese outside. There are, of course, lots of parodies and spoofs of particular horror works as well, fueled in part by Dilworth's love for the horror genre. So you have episodes inspired by Jaws, The Wolfman, The Village of the Damned, and a full-length parody of The Exorcist entitled The Demon in the Mattress. And that's the picture you're seeing on the slide there, and which sees Muriel possessed by a demon. It directly evokes scenes from the film. So Muriel levitates from the bed. She spins her head 360 degrees, and she vomits green material. And she even uses the quote from the film, quote, "She's in here with us." And the episode takes on quite a sickly green hue after this possession happens. It's as if the animation stock is itself diseased or tainted by the creature. Now, there's no expectation, I would think, that children should have been able to access any of these intertexts. And for many children, this would have been their first access to a sort of a horror-themed knowledge reference pool. However, Courage was somewhat more brutal with its horror references, I think, as because unlike many of the horror specials of the time, normally which take place outside of a show's established timeline or sort of see characters within the world celebrate Halloween, this was like horror cinema. The horror was real. Oftentimes the villain would win, and in many cases it would actively kill at least one of the characters. There's an example of this, and so in the episode that ended the first series, they're sort of really leaving it on sort of a real final note, is the Great Fusili, in which Courage fights against the titular alligator, who is a puppeteer. He transforms Muriel and Eustace into puppets, and although Courage defeats him, the humans do not transform back. So the episode ends, as you see on the slide here, with Courage manipulating his wooden owners about the house to sort of keep up the pretense of humanity. So this is me talking about intertext. What I want to move on to now is thinking about art and art styles. So Courage really had quite a distinct art style, characterised by harsh lines, unappealing colour schemes, etc. what I want to draw on here is Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas's 12 basic principles of animation. And these describe how animation evolved both to become more realistic, yet somehow still able to effectively capture abstract concepts like motion. And you're seeing the 12 principles on the screen there. And the one that I want to focus on, the one that I argue Courage clashes with most, is known as appeal. This is the shaping of cartoon characters to not be deliberately off-putting to the audience. Now that doesn't mean they're characters that are particularly sort of necessarily have to be likeable. That can be part of it, but rather that they're animated in a way that makes them endearing, relatable, memorable. Generally, this means they're animated in ways that are appropriate for the rules of animation as established, the designs aren't overly complicated, etc. Now, the designs of the Courage characters are quite striking, especially Courage himself. You know, he's bright pink, he stands out. The concept of order that underpins the design elements, though, is not quite there, because the show is deliberately confrontational. The farmhouse in nowhere is visited by all manner of creatures that don't belong to this world. To align them with the ordering logic of the normal, I say in inverted commas, part of the world, would in a sense completely dilute the effect. So this leads me on to sort of quite nicely a key strategy that's designed to be discomforting and scary. And what I've termed the fusion of art styles, and animators occasionally mixing in other art styles, other media, to generate an uncanny effect. So I said hold on to this tower. You see here this is a CGI creation. It's placed onto a 2D digital ink backdrop, and this is designed to sort of evoke classical animation practices. It fits, but there's something slightly off about it if you compare it to the sort of the curtain that you see on the slide. Elsewhere, you see here the spirit of the harvest moon played by an actual human face, superimposed onto the frame. But then the contrast is turned up to maximum. The eyes are blacked out. So it's a very sort of impressionist feeling. It's a fusion of the unexpected contrast of art styles, the manipulation of the human face into a really unfamiliar shape. Elsewhere, the episode, this is quite a famous clip as well in Courage circles, the episode Courage in the Big Stinking City, which uses jump scares, and it uses footage of things that you wouldn't normally see in sort of animated media. I'm going to play this clip first before I talk about it.
I just know something bad is going to happen.
And this is very famous as a jump scare. So Courage being sort of jumped 3 times, so by a clip from an old kaiju movie, a shark, and then a plasticine girl who sort of hides her monstrous face. The moments are particularly shocking because they break the rules Courage has established regarding its own art style. And by presenting 3 doors, the first 2 of which are essentially movie clips, and then breaking that for the third, it presents monsters that exist outside of the rules the show has established, both for itself and within this sort of mini sequence of sort of door opening. However, to best illustrate the uncanny effect evoked by the fusion of art styles, I'm going to turn to an infamous episode of the show, the infamous King Ramesses' Curse. So in the episode, an ancient slab is stolen from an Egyptian tomb and discovered outside the farm. Eustace claims it and then refuses to return it, making the spirit of King Ramesses come to inflict curses, inspired by sort of the biblical curses on Egypt, the plagues of Egypt, on the farmhouse. What makes the episode so widely remembered is the monster itself. It is a CGI rendered monster that moves its arms in a really sort of natural way, and it speaks in a quite discomforting aesthetic. Let me show you a clip.
Return the slab.
What?
Return the slab, or suffer my curse.
What's your offer?
So playing on the horror trope of the mummy, King Ramesses is such a completely unexpectedly different presence. His animation is so incongruous with the established style. He appears to be floating on the dirt. He doesn't really appear to be part of the world at all. And he's an effective fusion of lots of things that contribute to a horrifying imagery. So as well as the unsettling art style, he uses clashing colours, orange, pink, green, which really compound the feeling that this guy is sort of unnatural and uncomfortable. It's worth stating, however, he explicitly manifests from within the world, emerging from the slab that he desires, as initially a piece of 2D imagery that becomes 3D. And he's a literalization of this idea of sort of kind of 2D imagery becoming disturbing 3D. So this is quite uncanny CGI, and the presence of uncanny CGI would be evoked once again in sort of the final episode, Perfect. So this, in one of Courage's, so Courage is sort of worried about not being perfect, a sort of a Victorian-style matriarch appears and sort of tries to teach him. Now, in one of Courage's stress dreams about perfection, he witnesses this.
You're not perfect.
So this is clearly inspired, I think, by Harlan Ellисon's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Again, what makes this so effective? The CGI is incongruous, but it's completely unexplained. There is no sort of, this moment is dropped and then completely untouched again. So I mentioned there's this sort of schoolmistress character who sort of is ostensibly the villain, but she is not what anyone remembers about the episode. It is this single sequence that has no real bearing on the narrative, and that really actually sort of is the only thing anyone really discusses. So this is where I conclude the analysis. So it's the briefest structures, as with so many animated shows here. This is, I don't want to claim that Courage is the only thing that has ever combined sort of an established 2D art style with sort of unnatural looking art. There are tons of examples of this. But I think Courage is interesting, experimental even for an experimental era of animation. And it played with every trick in the animation book to frighten its viewers, and many of these strategies remain really quite horrific and unsettling even now. So this is the case really in which Courage is a great example of the ways in which sort of the actual aesthetic forms of different types of animation can be combined to create an upsetting, unnatural effect. You can think of tons of other examples that do this, and sort of many of which subsequently followed on. So things like SpongeBob as well is a great example of something that combines live action media. It combines sort of different types of animation. It combines sort of clips of, say, Nosferatu, not necessarily to scare, but to sort of have comedic incongruity. But Courage is a great example of the ways in which these devices can be deployed to scare, to unsettle, and to frighten. Thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope you found this interesting. And if you have any comments or thoughts, please do share them below. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on Courage the Cowardly Dog, on animation generally, and anything else you might want me to sort of break down in a sort of scholarly way. I want to make the videos that you guys want to see, so please do let me know. Thank you very, very much for watching this one. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe. I will look forward to seeing you all in the next one.